It's FAQ NYC Off Cycle, where the New Yorkers podcast from the newsroom by and for New Yorkers, the city, steps back to take different and deeper looks into some of the things that are always happening here in the only place in the world. I'm Harry Siegel, here with the inimitable Alex Brook Lynn for a conversation with photographer and also sometimes writer Stephen Yang, a fellow native New Yorker who's done some remarkable work for the New York Post and other outlets, including some riveting and harrowing shots of drug users, those including a feature about a former FDNY firefighter, David, now has a 10-bag-a-day heroin habit. Stephen, thanks for joining us, and let's jump right in. You've been shooting Manhattan and a lot of Midtown through the worst of the pandemic and since, and that's a place that's gone through a lot of different iterations in a remarkably short period of time. Do you want to talk about what you've seen there, how you've tried to capture it in your work, and your approach to shooting New Yorkers out in the streets and composing those shots?
Sure. I love Midtown Manhattan. It's really the place that I'm drawn to the most in the city, primarily because there's just so many different types of people that go to Midtown, and you don't have to walk very far in order to find huge disparities between people. And because it's also a tourist destination, people are they just are used to cameras, and they just don't care about being photographed. And more often than not, there are other people photographing as well. So it doesn't feel as intrusive in some ways. During the pandemic, it was really a great place to be because it was so empty. Without any of the workers, the office workers, the ecosystem collapsed. And so there were no vendors, there were no stores, there were no restaurants, there were no bars, no happy hours, any of that stuff. So it was very eerie and beautiful to walk around during that time. Not to mention, it was about a 17-minute drive from Kew Gardens to Midtown during that time. So that was amazing. I remember being at the middle of Midtown, and there was I was waiting patiently at the light, and then I realized I don't have to wait for this. There are no cars, there are no pedestrians, so I just drove right through it. It was great. And since then, New York has recovered in a lot of ways, but there's still pockets that are left unattended. One thing I noticed starting during the George Floyd protests, the police were very selective about what they were going to enforce. And partly that was probably because of the pandemic and they were worried about being in close contact with people. But I found a huge difference with how the police were operating within a place like Midtown, or with homeless people, with drug addicts, but also, with the looting. I was firsthand watching them not enforce any of the rules or laws, choosing not to intervene with gangs and other people who were doing the wide-scale looting, and then a day later going after some unarmed protests with full force and baton swinging and whatnot. But to bring it back to Midtown, it's a place that I just am drawn to in general. And from a news standpoint, being just settled in Midtown is a good place to be because you can easily drive out of it or hop on the subway. You're centrally located, and there's a lot of access to news events.
So there were a lot of homeless people who were placed in hotels in Midtown during the pandemic. And that was interesting to see. When I came to the city, the newsroom, its offices were right there. So I get off at Herald Square at 34th and ended up talking with a lot of the people who were staying in hotels who all sort of then disappeared and were moved elsewhere in a pretty short period of time. Some of those hotels are now actually where some migrants are staying. But that was striking. And I also, I'd see people who were just out on the streets, like not doing like the heroin nod where people lean back, but it's like they've got a string that's keeping them from falling, but who were just flat on the ground. And I was checking them to make sure people were alive and, sort of embarrassed about it and not wanting to bother them. But that was something I was not used to seeing in Midtown. my brother at one point, when he was in New York, saw a pair of people just having sex right outside of, the former, right by where the Macy's is and the Manhattan Mall. And, at the same time, there were people out, things happening. It's recovered a bunch since in terms of having office people and tourists especially back. But there were also pot guys around, just sort of selling. The police seemed really, really indifferent when I was there and working to a lot of these activities in interesting ways, like something had shifted after the pandemic with how they were dealing with this. So I'd like to key in on some of your photos, and I know Alex is going to want to jump in with those too.
There was nothing more striking than Midtown in 2020 making such a huge shift from the busiest, most bustling place on earth to completely empty, and to seeing the people who were out on the street it was a rare collection of people who needed to be out there, from first responders to homeless people who didn't have hotel rooms yet, who were being kicked out of conglomerate shelters at 8 a.m. every day, et cetera, et cetera. But the way you kind of captured it throughout the pandemic and after, also and before, I've been a fan of your work for a really long time, but it's really striking to have watched that almost like grow back. And so getting into some of these incredible photos, one I really wanted to point out, especially dealing with some of the addicts. Not all homeless people who got hotel rooms around 34th Street were addicts, but often the ones that did have substance abuse problems would hang out in the provided tables and chairs outside. And you have this gorgeous photo of a man stretched out on one of these like carved wood blocks that they have just for casual sitting over there. And it looks like he's sunbathing, and his ribs are kind of sticking out. And I don't know if the sky is orange or if that's a billboard behind it, but I'm kind of in a moment in this particular photograph. I don't know what time of day it is. I don't know if he's in trouble or not. I don't know if he's in relaxed or not. Like, I could look at this photo 1,000 different ways and tell 1,000 different stories. And this isn't 34. Oh, it's right by the TS place. Okay, so this is more up in the 40s. But anyway, can you talk a little bit about this particular photograph and just, what getting a shot like this means?
Sure. There are two parts of my brain usually working when I'm walking around. One side is the journalism side, which is trying to find a photo that illustrates a story or a concept, a specific thing, in which case I kind of need to get confirmation. So, sometimes you see someone laid out and it's easy to make an assumption about what they are doing or who they are or if they're on drugs or not. And oftentimes, I have to do due diligence of asking them or trying to figure out some definitive proof that they are indeed on drugs. The other half of my brain is just looking for moments, and I think my primary love is street photography and just sort of finding these little moments. And so in this instance, I'm just wandering around looking for interesting things happening around Midtown, and kind of like what you were alluding to before about, to me, what's so beautiful about a city like New York is the fact that we share all these spaces together, right? And we do a lot of things in public that I think in other places, smaller places, happen in private, or with fewer people around. So in this instance, I think he's just sunbathing, and he could be homeless. I'm not sure. But, it's this private moment in public. And that's something that I'm constantly trying to find as a photographer. And as, with the pandemic taught us and the kind of emptying of Midtown, it became the refuge of the homeless, the drug addicted, the people who had nowhere else to go. But as New York filled back up with workers and tourists and all that stuff, those people still are around. And so sometimes you do get these really interesting contrasts between something that you would ordinarily think of as a private moment, but it's happening in front of a bunch of people. And New York, to me, at its best, is that it belongs to everyone. You can stop and drink a beer on a stoop, or hang out on the street, and it feels like it feels yours for a moment, and then when you leave, it belongs to someone else.
Nothing strikes me so much as these private moments in public spaces than when you literally see people having their daily sleep, basically. We get 8 hours in a bed, or on a train or in a car if you work the night shift for like a daily newspaper. But you look at some of these, and I'm talking about the shot right here on the train where you have one person underneath. Oh no, that's just a duffel bag. So it's one person on the train and he is asleep, and his duffel bag is underneath because he's taken his shoes off for the evening. And I think what happened when the city got empty was a lot of people really saw it wasn't just nobody's sitting on that bench and everybody's crowded around for rush hour, but there was no rush hour. So people really saw the people who had to be sleeping out there. And what is it now? Let's talk a little bit about photographing homeless people while they're asleep. So I think, as a professional photographer, I look at this and I'm looking at you depict something, a very private moment in a public space, which has been talked about a lot around New York's houseless. But when it comes to talking about the invasion of that privacy or photographing homeless people, where do you fall on that debate? Like when you are deciding to take a picture, and deciding whether to go up to someone or not, what makes you decide to do it?
Just to jump in for 1 second there, you have photos of a guy jumping a turnstile, beautifully composed, a guy nodding out with a needle in his arm outside, and with David, that firefighter, like actually shots of him using drugs, but also a shot of him is pretty remarkable in the middle of stealing from a department store. And the homeless photo, the photo Alex mentioned earlier of the person presumably unhoused is sleeping on the train, like their face is recognizable, their faces in all these photos. And so I'd love to hear about your thought process and how you think about the ethics of these and in public spaces, and where you think boundaries are or should be.
Sure. I think it's a complicated topic that, at least for me, it runs through my head all the time. And I don't have a specific line in the sand that I'm not willing to cross, or there's no real way for me to explain, I guess, in absolute terms, what can and cannot be photographed. But it does, I guess I'll say, the value of the photograph, which is, to me, if it's worth taking or not, has to do with those two categories again of journalism or street photography. So for journalism, to me, it's a little clearer cut because oftentimes we're trying to tell a specific story. So for example, the guy sleeping in the subway car was about riders feeling uncomfortable about riding the subways again after the pandemic and the state of the subways. So to me, taking that photo for a journalistic purpose of explaining that sentiment and that reality of the situation is fine. I think that if it's happening in public, then it's able to be documented. And I think there are definitely delicate times where we have to tread a little lighter about that. Obviously you're not going to run up to someone and just start slamming a camera in their face unless you have to. But I think generally speaking, for journalistic purposes, it is our right, and we should exercise this right to document things that are unfolding in public. Now, on the other hand, you look at things like street photography, and the goal is a little murkier, I'd say. Am I taking this photo because it has some sort of artistic composition, or is it reflecting some kind of interior emotion of mine and I'm seeing it out in public. To me, the stakes are a little higher on that one because it's harder to justify. So I will pass over the average shot of someone just sleeping or laying there unless it to me is remarkable in some way, and if it somehow is better than the others. And but this debate goes in my mind all the time. Like I'm always questioning, should I be taking this photo? Is this photo worth taking? And more often than not, the negative thoughts win. The negative thoughts of saying, "Oh, don't take that photo. You're gonna, it's rude. It's getting in their face. It's invading their privacy. It's not. The photo isn't that good, anyways." And as a photographer, I think most of the time I'm spending my time trying to stop those voices from winning. And I heard a great talk with this guy, Ruben Ratting, who's a really amazing street photographer that I love, and his work. And he was talking about, like, there's just so many of these little things going through your head, like, oh, I'm tired. My wife, is like pissed that I'm like, out, or like, I've spent too much money on drinks or whatever. It's like you've got all these competing voices that they're telling you just to go home. And that's the biggest barrier to street photography, is just trying to get over that negativity and that negative thinking. And on the other hand, what makes street photography so exciting and fun, in my opinion, is the fact that it's kind of just going out not knowing what you're going to find. And so I can have like a bunch of negative thoughts and nothing's going to happen. And then I turn a corner and suddenly it's something better than what I could have imagined in the first place.
Spider-Man eating a banana.
Spider-Man eating a banana, exactly. Again, speaking to that private moment in a public space, and on 42nd Street, you have all the people that dress up as characters for tips, and this one guy is, he's got his Spider-Man mask off, and he's just like, he's just hungry. I love a lot of the ways you capture some of these private moments, especially, a guy taking a nap on a bed in a mattress store. I mean, that for me is one of, it's just so perfect. Like, you couldn't have written that moment. If somebody had written the script of your life, they would have put in, oh, the photographer walks down the street and there's a guy lying on a mattress. I mean, it's like the perfect setup for a photographer, and you take the perfect picture of it. And I like that there's a little tinge of that New York, tea kettle about to boil, sort of tapping, something's about to spill over. You have this one shot, and I can't even say who the subject is. And this woman is bent over barefoot, and she is in that pose that I see a lot in Europe, actually. She's in a pose that's where she's just bowing, head down on the street, but you have her from behind, and presumably that there's a cup of change in front of her. And another woman is looking for directions and pointing somewhere, and she's older, and the fold of her underarm skin is kind of showing. And another woman wearing a mask is trying to figure out where she's going with a wrinkled brow, talking on the phone. And there's this urgency in New York that you capture better than I've seen in many other photographs in this one. And I really like it. And it's sort of tinged around a lot of these other photographs, even though they're private and serene moments. So one of my questions for you was, as a journalist, when you're out there working, is that sometimes you get these art photos as well? Like, you'll see a shot and you'll say, well, that's not the job I'm working on, I'm going to snap that anyway. Or do you go out specifically on these sort of art photography walks? Like, how does that work with your life? How is it integrated, especially now that you're like a new father and you don't have a lot of time?
That's a great question. I mean, I think I've struggled with this for all my career. I'll give you a short answer. The short answer is that one of the great things about doing work for a daily newspaper is being out on the street all the time. I've learned so much through those daily assignments, but also in between those assignments. And so oftentimes, if there's a little bit of a lull between stories, I'll just walk around and try to capture these moments on my own, before I get assigned something else. So just being forced out of my apartment and into the street is just a huge, invaluable asset of working for a newspaper. So I love taking these little jaunts around, to see what's going on beyond the scope of what my assignment is. But, it took me a long time to get to that place too, because I think there's a point in a lot of people's careers where you're just hyper focused on the assignment in front of you, and all the energy goes towards that. And then I didn't really feel like I had the creative juice anymore to then go and shoot what I wanted to shoot. And that for me has been kind of like a merging of things. So, I think like a lot of creative people in the beginning, you start by copying, right? And like you see what you like and you try to copy it, emulate it. And I went through that exact same process when I was trying to become a journalist, because I don't come from a journalism background. So, I would look at journalistic pictures and be like, okay, so this is what they're doing. I want to do that. So therefore I should just copy, what they're doing. For example, like who am I copying?
Yeah,
okay, so
what are the elements of a composition you're picking up that way? Like, oh, they're doing this in the middle ground, or this with the focal point, or whatever.
Yeah, so I think, when I was first starting out trying to be a journalist, I would look at a lot of the New York Times photographers, Greg Heisler, Damon Winter, and in the beginning, you're just trying to copy style, right? And like you're trying to copy the way the light looks and trying to unpack what's going on, technically speaking. And, what lens are they using? What camera they're using? Like all that stuff. What is the toning? And, I think I got stuck in that for a while of like trying to copy. And I try to erase my own personal style or the way that I wanted to see things. And then at a certain point, I realized that just my copies were not very good, and then I think people even told me that, that like, well, this is pretty good, but it looks like you're trying to be a journalist, and that's not really the path to success. And so people encouraged me to try to shoot the way I wanted to shoot. And that's such a nebulous piece of advice to anyone aspiring to be a writer or a musician or a photographer. It's like, find your voice, be like, okay, well, how do I do that? And in my case, the way was just trying to do as many things as I could, and a lot of them failing, and eventually, like, me realizing what kind of photographer I am and what I like to do, what I'm drawn to. And it's a never-ending process, right? Like it's something that will go on forever. But that's part of the fun of doing this job. Like if I looked back on my stuff from 10 years ago, some of it will have this innocence to it, some sort of kind of, I don't know, some kind of spark of the imagination that I don't feel now. And some of it will just be terrible. And I think part of the process is like, that's a good thing, right? It's good to look at old photos and think, man, this sucks, because that means that we're headed somewhere, right? And it's going in a direction. If I get to the point where I'm looking at my old photos and they're all better than my current ones, then, I think I have a problem.
When I was 19 and starting to take some photos for the New York Sun, or maybe I was 20, I was 19 or 20, either way, I think one of my main goals was just not to fuck up, like not to screw up in the moment. And I had all these, like when I would be not at work, I would have all these lofty goals in my brain. And then I would get to the thing I was supposed to photograph and I would just be like, please don't mess up. Please don't mess up. Please don't miss it. And all of the ideas I had in those first moments about trying to set up my shot and find the angle flew out the window. And I think a lot of young photographers working for newspapers really get caught off guard, that they think they're going to have the time, but when they get out there at first, they just want to do a good job. So there's also that fear that swarms around it.
So true. So true. Yeah. I mean, there's so many times, like, now in my daily life, even, where I have an idea of how it's going to play out, and then it doesn't. And I think what I've had to learn is how to shift my expectations to what's actually happening quick enough, because we do all want to do a good job. We have a certain idea of how it's going to work. But I have to say, some of my favorite photos in the news context were when it did not happen as I thought it would. And there were actual technical limitations. There were some days where I was covering the protests in Brooklyn during 2020, and I had kind of the wrong camera, like it was not a fast enough lens, like, there was, not really good at high ISO. And because of that, I had to like slow my shutter speed. I had to throw a flash on there, and it was not what I wanted, but it actually ended up being better than what I expected. And I love those parameters. And on the whole, I love parameters. I love that journalism gives me these parameters to work with. I find myself much more creative within limitations than someone like a filmmaker or a fashion photographer who can conceive of a creative idea from nothing and just make it happen.
Speaking of shutter speeds and some of these technical limitations, the Post, I'm told, and I heard this at the Daily News too, traditionally always wanted flash photography and to avoid having too much contrast because allegedly it costs too much at the printers if you have all these deep blacks instead of grays. But your photos seem to have a lot of real black. Sometimes they're really interesting, like under exposures. So can I just ask how you think about those elements in relation to your work and your journalistic work?
And then just for our listeners real quick, some of these photos, if you're not looking at them right now, but just going to search for them later, like there is a lot to Stephen Yang's photography that is almost takes on a Baroque painting type of feel with, deep, really, really just like deep and dark colors contrasted by rigs of light and things like that. So, so some of these are very moody and not at all what you would expect the Post to want, which is like big flash, perp walk, kind of thing. These are artsy.
It's very kind of you both. I really, I guess I'll say this in two different ways. One is that it's true. I love that you brought up this idea of the Post wanting flash and full length vertical, because that is still burned in my brain. I still, when I'm shooting, think, oh shit, did I get a full length vertical? Even if it does not make sense at all for the assignment. But, the flip side of that is that I learned how to use a flash. I really did not. I fancied myself, like many others, a natural light photographer, someone who only takes photos of available light. And because the Post had those really, in my mind, arbitrary, restrictions, it taught me how to use a flash. Now it's funny that flash has become kind of like in vogue in the photography world and even in the journalism world.
Harsh flash.
Harsh flash, yeah. But that's sort of like the look in my mind of like the Post, of like that kind of like on camera hard light look. And to be honest, sometimes it does look better. I think for court cases and perp walks, like it does add a bit of drama. It feels more in line with Ouija and that kind of lineage of the gritty New York stuff. But like I was afraid to show what I liked, to the Post and to any of the clients that I shot for over the years. I think, again, for a lot of time, I was stuck in this idea of like, they want this, I should provide that, like that's what it is. That's why they're hiring me. And over the years, people have told me the opposite, actually. It's like they already have what they shot or was shot before, like try to bring them something new, try to bring them something different. And that led me down a different path of trying to just shoot it the way I wanted to shoot it, sometimes with too much contrast or with funny colors or whatnot. And, the Post has actually been very tolerant of it. I'm still kind of waiting for them to, for the phone call to be like, hey, can you just like shoot it normal, like, and not all in that fucked up way? But so far, they've been pretty supportive of it. And, they recently got a new photo director in the last few years who's really opened up, I think, a lot of the stylistic choices we can make and encouraging us to think about things outside the traditional tabloid parameters, which has been hugely helpful just psychologically, going out there with the ability to have a little more creative freedom.
Speaking of transitions in your both professional and artistic practice and how they intersect, can we talk a little bit about you starting to also be the reporter and writer, and starting to uh, create features, and not just photo series, but features that you also write the story of, and how that transition happened? And if I might be incorrect. Many years ago, when I first met you, just as a friend, you were really interested in the buses that went to Atlantic City, and and photographing that. And then more recently, you have this amazing, in-depth, emotional piece about an ex-FDNY guy who gets caught up in addiction, and he allows you to go with him and photograph him. And you also made the words. So, what can you tell me a little bit about that transition? Had it been in the works for a while? Was it something you just sort of stepped into and tried out, and then you really dove in? How did it work? Were you nervous? All of that.
Originally, I wanted to be a writer. I studied literature in college, and I guess I wanted to be an academic, but I realized pretty quickly I didn't have the chops for that. And I did some writing, creative writing, things like that in high school and college. Most of it pretty terrible. And I kind of fell into photography just as something that I like to do. I just kind of kept on going with the photography, and it ended up being a pretty decent job, and just kept me outside all the time, which I really wanted. And, specifically with the FDNY piece, that was because I'd been going around photographing sleeping addicts for, days. People passed out, people in the midst of nodding out, things like that. And at a certain point, part of me felt like it was wrong. It felt like I should engage with them and try to talk to them. And then also, just from an aesthetic point of view, I was getting the same photo over and over again. It was just someone passed out. And so I just walked up to this guy, and he was unwrapping some heroin from his wallet, in those little like glassine packets or something. And I just introduced myself. I said, "Hey, I'm a photographer. I'm doing a story about heroin use. Do you mind if I, photograph you and like hang out?" And he just said yes immediately, which is not what I was expecting. I really thought he was going to tell me to go fuck myself, and he let me follow him around all day, interviewing him on video, taking photos. And I was a little shy about it. Like I didn't want to be like, "Okay, are you going to do some heroin now?" Like I knew it would come up at some point, but he kind of just broke the ice immediately. He was like, "Do you want to see me do heroin?" Like within the first 15 minutes. And I was like, okay. So, I watched him do heroin, and it was the first time I'd actually seen the entire process, of like pulling it through the cigarette filter into a syringe and injecting it, and then the immediate effect of it, which was, to be quite honest, pretty kind of frightening, how powerful it was. And I realized as he was kind of nodding out, we hadn't talked about like, should I call for help at some point? Should I, seek some sort of aid for him? I mean, because as he was nodding out, I was just thinking like, what am I going to do? Am I just going to like keep on taking photos of this guy while he dies? Like, that doesn't seem right. But thankfully he kind of like snapped out of it at a certain point, and we were able to have that conversation. And he told me, kind of point blank, like, call the cops if I turn blue. And, that was a pretty stark moment. But, he was very excited to have me around in a lot of ways. I kept on asking him over the course of the day, like, why did you say yes? Like, why did you agree to this? And I just sensed like a deep sense of loneliness within him, this idea that he just wanted someone to have an interest in him, and the shame around drugs was mine, not his, like I was ashamed of the effects of the drugs, the procurement, the administering. But he was not ashamed of it. That's his daily life. And so he saw nothing wrong with it. And, he took me, shoplifting, which was pretty exciting. I fretted over whether we should use those images. Had many, talks with the editor at the Post about, like, is this gonna like get him arrested? Am I complicit? Am I gonna get subpoenaed? And, the editor was like, you're thinking about this way too hard. They're not gonna care. And nothing ended up happening because of those photos.
Also, I think it's a misdemeanor. I actually think like a lot of people come, it's a whole debate right now how soft we are on like shoplifting by addicts, and a lot of your law and order guys in New York right now talk about how it's a scourge on New York, small time shoplifting. But I don't think he would have gotten sent up the river either way.
Yeah, I was worried about how much he was taking. He took quite a few items from an electronics store. But so okay, so I ended up spending around 6-7 hours with him. I'm getting kind of tired by the end of it, and I feel like we've kind of gone through the cycle of doing the heroin a couple times, the stealing, and I was getting tired, and I felt like, okay, I've got a pregnant wife at home. I should probably get home. And I made a big mistake, right? I made a mistake. Like I left, thinking that I'm going to be able to find this guy like tomorrow. And he gave me the phone number of his mom and his girlfriend. So I was thinking like, all right, well, it'll be okay. I can find him. So I go home, and for the next 12 or 14 days, I go out trying to find him. I can't find him at all. All the spots where I went to the store he went to buy hair dye. I went to the spot where he was shooting heroin, where he hung out. I did the loop, between the heroin dealers on 42nd and 8th and the methadone clinic and the like 39th and 8th. And I just could not find him at all. And I felt like such an idiot, because I could have shown so many more things, right? I could have gone back to where he stayed. I could have met his girlfriend. I could have shown him eating something. I could have, just really like shown a lot more of this guy's life instead of just heroin and stealing, which to me was was very exciting, but it was not the full picture of who this person is. And I just had this huge regret. And so the only thing I could think of doing after, a few days of looking for him was to start transcribing all the interviews. And so I transcribed all the text that, all the things we talked about. And I wrote down all the things we did. And partly it was just because I was frustrated. But then by the end of it, I realized that I had kind of an article. And so just out of, curiosity, I emailed the editor and I said, hey, like, I can't find him, but I wrote this thing, like, kind of explaining what happened. Like, do you mind taking a look at it? And they were very supportive, and they really liked the writing. And the editor in chief, really helped me a lot, very closely, to edit it. He streamlined it. He took out some of the parts, but he was very protective of my vision for it, which I really appreciated. He really kept on like making it clear that he didn't want to change it too much. He wanted it to have the same essence of what it felt like. So it was really a very positive experience to be like taken under the wing of like a really good editor, and like, have them just take all your jumbled stuff and put it into like this really more succinct piece. And
God bless editors.
yeah, seriously. No, really. It's such an essential part that never gets seen. And after that, I think they gave me a little bit more leeway. And also just for myself, like I became a little more confident in this idea of like, I can gather some quotes and put them together. And if they want to use it, then great. If they don't, then that's fine too. But it was really nice to like kind of come back to writing after all these years, because I just really lost sight of it completely, since college.
Have you seen or heard from David since the piece ran?
I've been in touch with his mom, and actually I was meaning to reach out again because we've been doing all these stories about Trank. And I was actually wondering to myself the other day whether when I photographed him, he was actually shooting Trank and fentanyl and not heroin, because quite a number of people have been telling us that heroin hasn't been on the street for at least 5 years or so. But I talked to his mom after. I went and I drove over and I met his mom in Staten Island, and we did an interview, and she shared some old photos of David, and we did some photos of her, and she was just so nice and like very transparent about her experiences. And so I followed up with her after the article ran, and she said that he was upset and he didn't like the article. But she was very kind and said, like, I don't blame you, and people don't always want to see what they look like. And she was not angry. She was very nice about it. But I did lose touch with her. I followed up with her probably 2 or 3 more times after that, just to see if he was ready to see me again. And I'm always like in the back of my head thinking I'm going to bump into him in Midtown. And for me, like the perfect follow-up, would be that he ends up getting clean, and we can do a follow-up story about, his process of getting sober and seeing what that looks like. But I haven't heard from his mom in a while now.
When we had Susan Watts on, and she was talking about her Gloria photos, she actually did do that sort of follow-up, and then was telling us that afterward, she ended up returning to her addiction. And then that wasn't a story at that point, of course. And it's always complicated, as journalists, figuring out what the beginning, the middle, and especially the end is. Stephen, thank you so much for taking all this time. People are interested, they can find a whole bunch more of your work at StephenYangPhoto.com. That's StephenYang, photo.com. And just to close out here, I've been on those Atlantic City buses, and the ones that come back, when you're giving up at 4 in the morning, 5 in the morning, and you come back and it's just like messed up, defeated gamblers. Plus, people from Jersey, northern Jersey, who are trying to like just commute to work in the city, and they're just sharing a bus, and it's such an interesting, sad collection of characters, a few different ways. But do you want to talk a bit about the photographers who've influenced you, and and how you've thought about their work as you were imitating and coming into your own, and now?
Just one side note. I don't think the Atlantic City buses was me, but I did do a story on dollar vans. Maybe that's what it was a long time ago in Brooklyn.
Sorry, that is what I was thinking of.
But it's a great idea. I love it.
But no, it was when you were doing the dollar vans one.
Yeah, no worries.
That's right.
FAQ NYC field trip on the AC buses.
The dollar vans are going away, aren't they?
I don't know.
Jose Martinez has done a fair amount about this. You can read At the City.
At the City.
In that thought.
So cool that you guys are part of the city now too. I thought that I didn't realize that. I think when I was first starting out as a photographer, I had no sense of this being a job or even of journalism. I just like to take pictures, and I was very afraid of people. I didn't want to take photos of people at all. I just took photos of shadows and street scenes and patterns and things like that. And I probably did that for the first, I don't know, 5-10 years of my photography. I really was afraid to approach people, even to pose people. Any of that stuff just terrified me, and still to this day kind of does. But the first time I think I saw a photo series that really moved me was Nan Goldin's Ballad of Sexual Dependency. I think that's right. It was in a gallery. I think it was at the Ace Gallery, and they had it playing with this Bjork song. It was a slideshow, and it was all these different portraits and kind of candid moments put together with this chant. I think it's called like Kyrie Ellison or something. It was just mesmerizing to sit in this gallery and watch these amazing photos of people and things be mixed together with this hypnotic music. And that really made me want to shoot people, made me realize that I can shoot a million shadows. But there's something about the variable of people that will be endless. It's an endless variable, whether it's a person on the street or it's your best friend. You can just keep on shooting it and get new results over and over and over again. And, I was also influenced by Walker Evans, the Subway series, Many Are Called, this idea of just like freezing people in time and being able to look back and seeing the similarities. You look at some of those photos and it looks like the clothes are different, everything is different, but the face is the same. It's like that.
Mm-hmm.
Like I know that person, that tired guy on the subway, or the guy leering at the girls.
I was just quickly when a long time ago, a friend of mine and I were shooting fishmongers down at the Fulton Street Fish Market in like 2004. When we put together all the footage, we found some old school footage. There was two guys arguing just over some bullshit, like nothing serious. And we had recorded. And then when we went to archival footage, we found like almost the same argument with the same physical motions caught on film between two fish guys, and we cut them side by side, and it was really kind of amazing to see that through line, that commonality, over the ages.
I love that. I love that about photography, and like, I forget, someone said this, but they were like, if you want a good photo, just take it and then wait 40 years. Because like it's just it'll get better, like and even the little most banal scenes become just so magical because of those, like you said, the continuities and then all the things that are different, which is what also makes shooting New York so fun, because a lot of it can look the same, even 100 years later, and that's part of the romance of taking photos, is like participating in that. I was also a big fan of Philip Lorca de Corsia, did the Hustler series where he paid male hustlers like the amount I think that he would have to pay for a sexual service, but to take their portrait. And that to me, but he lit it in this kind of like almost high fashion advertising way. And to me, that was again this idea of like bridging reality with art. Which is, to me, what's the most fun about photography is reality is the strangest of all, and it is endlessly entertaining to look at reality.
Stephen, that's a beautiful closing note. Thank you so much for joining us and taking the time. I hope we'll continue this conversation.
Thank you, guys. I'm really honored, and you guys said such nice things. Like I really, it feels nice to be, to have people have an interest in my work. It's really just such a nice thing to be profiled. So I really appreciate you guys, taking an interest and putting in the time to put it together. I really enjoyed listening to your episodes with Susan and Ben. Yeah. It was really cool.
Oh, Ben, I bought a pigeon photo off him. because he was like, he said, oh, for a print, it was something on Instagram. It was before I really knew him that well. And his pigeon photo is great. And you have one here, which are two pigeons, like looking so in love against not the famous part of a New York skyline, but it's New York because like the buildings are the way they are and the sky is gray. And I'm just like, I got to ask Steven, because I want a room filled entirely with pigeon photos from like really good New York photographers.
Absolutely. I will absolutely get you that print.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll pay.
No, you don't have to. It's I'd be honored to be part of the pigeon wall.
FAQ.
This has been FAQ NYC. We're part of The City, a nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom dedicated to hard-hitting reporting that serves the people of New York. Our work is freely available to everyone at thecity.nyc and is supported by listeners and readers like you. Go to thecity.nyc/give if you'd like to pitch in. We're an affiliate of NYU's McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy and Research, and are a proud member of the Brick House Cooperative of independent journalists, critics, and artists. Find it all at popula.com. Our hosts this episode were Alex Brook, Lynn, and me, Harry Siegel, who's also our executive producer. Our engineer is Adam Camara. Special thank you to our guest, Stephen Yang. All four of those people being native New Yorkers. Hooray for us, I suppose. Thank you, listener, for joining us and making it this far. Be kind, be cool. We'll be back soon with more. Cut.
Excellent. I was going to say, it was too much, but I was going to tell you, Stephen, the best photo I passed up, or the best profile, the best guy to talk to. There was this guy who I ran into on the corner of Christopher and 7th Avenue, and he was helping the guys. Like, there was this group of addicts that hung out there for years, and one guy who was on and off methadone, so he had the swollen calves and everything, and his injection sites, when he wasn't on methadone or doing heroin anyway or whatever, his injection sites were getting really, really bad. Plus he had diabetes. So this guy, I think I remember his name being Ernie. He was like dressing their wounds and helping him keep the feet clean and everything. I was like, hey, and he goes, yeah, I call myself, a street medic. And the other guy was like, yeah, he used to be a nurse. And I said, great. Can I was in a rush. I really got to go. Can I please get your number? He's like, well, I don't have a cell phone, but my friend, this is the cell phone. You can leave a message for me there, et cetera. You know the deal. And I was like, yeah, okay. And I don't know what appointment. I'll never remember what appointment I was going to fucking run for, but I will always remember that guy. And I will always regret not blowing off whatever I had to blow off and talking to him.
I feel like though that like you got to have that feeling, right? I mean, like that's what that feeling allows you, to the next time you see something to be like, oh shit, I know how valuable that is, and like and that's sort of one of the things that's lost with film and digital, like because film was like kind of expensive,
precious,
and
scarce.
Yeah, scarce. Like, there was a sense of missing it or choosing not to do it. And then like when it really like, meant something, then taking it, and so I think you need that sense of loss to just be a creative person. I think it's actually a net gain for you.
Yeah.